Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this one-off exclusive webinar where we have a illustrious panel of guests joining us from all the way over in the UK. Before we do start, I just thought we should acknowledge the First Nations people as the traditional owners of the land that we're all on today. I acknowledge all elders, past, present, and emerging. So for many of our member schools, whether it be here in Australia or anywhere else around the world, we've been inundated with requests to run a webinar on living with COVID in boarding. So we thought, well, what can we do? Who can we reach out to? And we thought our good friends at the BSA and our UK boarding schools have lived through this. We have large numbers of active cases in their boarding houses, and what a great opportunity to take their expertise, take their knowledge, and share that with our member schools. I should also make note that to our panel with us today, I do apologise for you having to go back through your torture days and relive them all for us. But to Beth, thank you so much for organising this. You've been absolutely wonderful. And to our panel, we're really looking forward to this. To kick things off, I thought it would be really important for our member schools to learn a little bit about all of the schools that we have with us today so they can compare their own boarding house appropriately. We're extremely fortunate to have four special guests with us today. And we have Areti Bazwa, head at Luckley House School. We have Joe Gale, deputy head boarding and pastoral from Royal Alexandra and Albert School. We have Craig Middleton, assistant head pastoral and staff from Millfield School. And we have Dale Wilkins, director of safeguarding, professional development and accreditation from the BSA. So we might start with yourself, Areti, if you'd like to give a little bit of an overview of your school.
Hi, everyone. So Luckley is a small school, but by UK standards, we only have about 325 pupils in our school. So for all of you in Australia who are working in a small school environment, hopefully what I have to say will be relevant to you, because I think small schools probably had to respond a little bit differently to much larger schools, and we had a lot more flexibility actually in comparison to larger schools. I have two boarding houses that over COVID I actually ran as one house because our international numbers dropped a bit. They completely back up this year, so we're back up to two houses. And just to give you a brief overview, I had the most I ever had was 15 cases at once, which in comparison to some of the larger schools you'll probably hear from today might not sound like a lot, but managing that in one small school was enough. So there you go. And we co-ed secondary.
Co-ed secondary. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Areti. Joe, we might hand over to yourself.
The classic faux pas of the moment. So my name is Joe Gale. I'm deputy head at Royal Alexandra and Albert School. Our school is a state boarding school. We've got girls and boys, and we've got boarders from age 7 up to 18. We're slightly larger. We've got just shy of 500 boarders, and we've got around 630 non-boarders. So giving us in excess of 1,000 pupils. We've got 9 boarding houses, so we have slightly less flexibility with such a large cohort, and we've been almost at our full capacity in the last two academic years, which has made things quite challenging at times. In terms of a sort of brief snapshot of our journey, in March 2020, we closed all 9 boarding houses as we had cases in all of them. We reopened 2 weeks later with 1 boarding house for our vulnerable pupils, and also children of critical workers. We then remained open throughout, and holidays, we only closed for our long summer holiday. And then in 2021, in September, we have seen a sharp rise. It's a rocky ride, should we say, through 2021. And then into 2021, September 2021, where we were hoping to return slightly back to normal, we've seen sharp rises in cases. And I don't want to alarm anyone, but I'll just give you a few figures from the last term's COVID cases. Started within our junior boarding house because we weren't routinely testing the juniors. They were below the age threshold. We feel that's probably where it started to take a bit of a foothold as such in the junior house. And at one point we had 36 out of 64 boarders who had tested positive for COVID, and that was in the week beginning the 20th of September. So we worked very closely with our local health organisations and Public Health England, put in place measures to try and curb the number of cases, and then made the decision to close that house and give it a 10-day sort of fire break, if you like, and we've seen a return to some normality in terms of the number of cases. Our total figures have been pretty high this term. It's been the toughest term. It eclipses anything we've experienced in the last 18 months in terms of the number of cases. With 170 positive PCR cases for our borders, and that spread throughout all of our houses, despite lots of measures in place to try and curb the flow. I think one of the key things, if maybe jumping ahead, but the learning we've done is that you need to have really thorough planning, and you need to have a clear committee, if you like, with specific roles within that committee to make sure that you're dividing the load and you've got real clarity about who's leading on particular areas, because there's quite a lot to organise. And if you don't have that clarity, then things can, not get out of hand, but you can lose the fact of being on the front foot, and you need to stay on the front foot. Key thing is that you're gathering and collating data if you do have cases emerging in your school, so that you can make informed decisions, and that when you liaise with outside organisations, you're really in touch with the data and you know exactly what the picture is in your school. The protocol that you need to develop from the work that the committee does needs to be absolutely crystal clear. One of the key challenges we've found is that whilst our COVID committee, with me as a member, really clear on the protocol, when you go out to your boarding house staff, your matrons, your health centre staff, the clarity can sometimes sort of diminish a little bit. So making sure you're using really visually accessible flow charts and protocols is really key. And it's really evident, I'm sure my colleagues will speak about this, that we need to make sure that you also look after staff welfare and pupil welfare, which is no mean feat, I'd have to say. So that's a little bit of a snapshot into our situation. Cheers.
That's great, Joe. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think the 170 cases there will certainly scare a few of our Australian schools here, that's for sure. Craig, we might jump over to yourself.
Yeah, welcome all. I think I might be the biggest school here, so to speak. I'm Craig Middleton, the assistant head at Millfield here. We have 1,300 pupils in the school, currently 900 boarders, over 19 boarding houses, and that's on a campus facility. And then we have 3 country houses as well, where we have to shuttle and bus the children in. Our international makeup is about 20%, just over 20% within that market as well. And we have had some students, which I know you've also had out there, that haven't been home for the last 18 months or 2 years as well. So they've been residing on site in some of our houses as they've had to throughout the time. In terms of numbers, a very similar sort of trajectory that Joe referred to. We set up early a COVID response team even before anyone came back. The school was closed for a period of time when the UK went into lockdown, but then since that we have been open. It's fair to say from September this year, there's been an exponential growth of cases within the school, ranging from 5, 6 to 10 cases in a house of 60 students, all the way up to, in our junior houses, being the total of sort of 60+% in that one house at one period of time. And obviously they've required different responses as we've been moving forward. And our total positive cases over the term so far are most likely about the 190 mark so far on PCR machines. So obviously that requires some careful management of that as we go through. And particularly with all of us having sort of centralised catering and all of that we have in our school, it's quite an interesting dynamic to be feeding, let alone all the other logistical issues, 1,300 plus staff as well in this environment.
That's great, Craig. Thank you for sharing. Dale, we might hand over to yourself now for a little bit of an introduction, please.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Dale Wilkins. As Jared said, Director of Safeguarding, Professional Development and Accreditation at Boarding Schools Association. And I've been associated with Boarding Schools Association for best part of 20 odd years. Firstly as a boarding practitioner, working as a trainer for them, and then for the last coming up for 5 years now, 4.5 years now, working for them full time. And I think the lessons I've learned in this COVID era really are exactly to back up what Joe was saying about the clarity that's required and the communication. I gave out our first COVID alert on the 26th of January 2020, where we were sort of talking about the vague possibility that this disease that was causing problems in China might impact some of the Chinese pupils coming back to our schools. Within 2 months, the country was in lockdown. So I think we learned from that just how quickly things go. And those are obviously similar experiences to those you've had in Australia. We've got 600 member schools in BSA right the way around the world. And the advantage of that, and I know ABSA has some international members as well, is you do get a picture of what's going on elsewhere, which has been really helpful. We've got about 480 in the UK. And we have a similar dynamic, I think, to what you've seen in Australia, where the rules in England and the rules in Scotland are slightly different. The rules in Wales are different again. Then there's Northern Ireland. And I know you've had that issue with Queensland, with New South Wales, Victoria, all of the different parts of Australia with slightly different rules, causing problems when pupils are trying to cross borders. So you're familiar with some of the kinds of issues that we've had. And at the moment, we have one at the moment where the isolation rules in Wales are slightly different from the isolation rules in England. And I think those are the kinds of things which actually take up far more time than they should. Obviously, if you're a school that's quite close to one of the internal borders, then that's going to make a big difference to you. If you're a school that only takes from your own state and has very few coming in from outside, then that will be less of an issue for you. But those have really been the things here. And I think, again, the things that perhaps I'll go on and elaborate later are really about making sure that you are fully flexible. All of our schools have had to be really, really flexible. They've had to expect everything and anything to happen. Joe was talking about his committee. I think you also have to factor in what do you do when most of your committee have got COVID, where you've got staff who are on their knees because they've been running the house by themselves because everyone else is symptomatic and isn't allowed to come in. So I think all of those are issues that we've seen coming through. But I think the other thing which I would really highlight, and I think this webinar really illustrates this point, is we've found that an awful lot of good has been done by schools learning from each other, working with each other, talking to each other, sharing ideas, sharing suggestions, finding out what other people are doing. And what other schools, what Craig does in his school of 1,300 won't necessarily work at Luckley House, but the principles, I think, are quite often the same. And I think that's the really important thing, is to learn from each other, to talk to each other, to keep in communication, and to see what works well elsewhere, and to use other people's issues to anticipate what might go wrong in your school as well. I think that's a really important lesson that we've learned right the way across the sector. So that's a brief intro to me, and I'm happy to elaborate on any of those points as we go along, Jared.
No, that's great, Dale. Thank you so much for sharing. And you mentioned schools learning from each other. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we're extremely grateful to have this panel with us tonight, or your morning, to share with our members. So we might get into things, guys. And what we did here in Australia, we reached out to our members and asked for some burning questions that they had when it came to this topic. And if I was asked to, if I was to ask each of you every single question, we'd be here for 4 days straight. So I'll ask a couple of you each question. But if there is someone that feels that they could really add value to that specific question, please just raise your hand, and then I'll come to you and we can talk about that. So let's get into things. The first question, I guess, that we've been asked is if any boarders in your boarding house contact COVID. If they contract COVID, are you required to send them home? What's the process when it first all happens? Joe, I might start with yourself.
What in our school at present, we work with the families to liaise with them and see if we can get them home. I mean, it's not ideal for a child to isolate in the boarding house. Logistically, it's a challenge. To look after their welfare, it's a challenge. It's not a particularly nice experience for them, despite all the things that we try and put in place to support them. However, we do have children who isolate in the boarding house given their sort of family circumstances. So it's a case-by-case basis, and that's been the situation right the way through. In most instances, families do pick them up take them home, because they can, you know, they can provide a little bit more TLC.
Yeah, sure. I can see both Craig and Areti are nodding there. Craig, did you have any other thoughts on that?
No, I would say with our parents, most of them would collect about 80%. What we had issues with is parents or guardians in particular, maybe, that were critically extremely vulnerable or had their own problems that restricted their child or their student coming back to them. So then what it did end up with is lots of flexibility within boarding houses to suddenly change roomings and to move the house around and have that flexibility, and almost from day one sell that to the students in the house that, look, we are in this time that's new to us all, and you're going to have to work with us so we can have that flexibility to support them as best we can. Unfortunately, when they are in isolation in the house, it's not hugely pleasant. They are sort of restricted to rooms and that, even though we try to make it as good as we can for them, they are in their rooms and isolated for 10 days in that regard.
You mentioned the word isolating there, and Dale, I might ask yourself, from a safeguarding perspective, we call it, of course, child protection here. Yeah. How does that fit in with everything that's going on in terms of isolating kids and so on?
I think the key message we've had from members right the way through is that, you know, they find it really difficult to, you know, to see how some of the things we're expecting these young people to do fit with our safeguarding responsibilities. And I think it's about making sure you've done everything you possibly can to ensure that child is safe. And I think the point that's been made a couple of times about their mental health is really important. You know, work within the guidance as best you can. You know, look at the guidance as to what's allowed within, you know, within situations where a child is isolating, and make sure that you follow the guidance carefully, but make sure you also really take, you know, the child's mental health and well-being into account, and that you're doing everything you can to support them. Just sticking them in a room for, you know, for however long your isolation period is, and say, right, that's you, we'll see you in 10 days, and sort of pushing the meals under the door almost prison style is clearly not you know, what's required. And I think a lot of schools have been really creative in terms of what they've done. I mean, obviously in the online world, we're in a far better position than we would have been. You can engage with them online, you can communicate with them regularly, but it's about them feeling that you're there to help them and to support them. And I think you know, if you've got a bespoke medical centre where, you know, staff are able to come and go and are able to deal with positive cases and interact with them because they've got full protective equipment on, I think that's hugely beneficial. But not every school can do that. So I think every school has to be, you know, really reactive to what they're able to do, but absolutely at the fundamental core have that key principle of, you know, are we keeping these children safe? And I think one of the issues that one or two of our schools have faced is where they've had pupils who have really not coped with the isolation, and what do you do then? And there have been a couple of cases where they've had to contact the local health authorities and really talk through, you know, the danger, the mental health danger to this individual from keeping them locked in isolation versus, you know, the requirement to follow the law and to keep them in. So I think it can be challenging, but I think the key principle is to, you know, follow the guidance, but have at the absolute centre of everything you do the welfare of your child. And I think also in terms of the long game, you know, thinking into the future, you know, I can tell you some schools that have done an absolutely fantastic job in terms of their future promotion of what boarding's all about by the way they've handled these cases and by the way they've looked after people's children during this process. And I can also, you know, possibly give one or two of examples of schools that actually have put the interests of the school first and the interests of the child second. And I think that will come back to bite them later on. I think, you know, parents will remember that, pupils will remember that, and I don't think it will do them any favours down the line.
No, that's great. Very well said. And I've noticed our panel have all put their hands up here, which is fantastic. So thank you all.
You touched a few nerves there, I think, Jared.
I think I may have. Already, I'll start with yourself. Your hand was up first.
Just to add from a small school perspective, because I think it's quite good. We've got a small kind of medium and large school. We were able to put together a series of rooms in a wing of the house, actually in one of our separate houses, that we used for isolation. And the problem that I found wasn't so much after the PCR had come back positive, but what to do with someone while they were waiting for the PCR. Because once the PCR came back positive, people were pretty happy to come and collect where they could. when they couldn't, they would stay in the separate house that we had set up, or house, more like a corridor of rooms, really. And but while they were waiting, especially if they were feeling fine, the challenge that you have with parents and the pupils also is they're not symptomatic at all. They might have had a positive LFT or lateral flow test, and then they've gone to have a PCR test, and they feel very well within themselves, but yet they have to isolate. And in some ways, that is actually harder to deal with than a child who's unwell. Because a child who's unwell, but most of my parents are quite local, so they will just come and get their child as they normally would. If they had a cold, they'd come and collect them. But to keep someone isolated within themselves, they're feeling fine and there's nothing wrong with them, poses a slightly different challenge. So I think you probably need to have a game plan for those children as well, and how to deal with those parents. I'd echo what Joe said about a committee, and making sure that your final comms actually just come from 1 or 2 people only, which in my size school you can do, rather than having multiple people give an answer, which potentially could end up different. But in terms of how to isolate or send them home, if they're unwell, we try to send them home as normal. But if they couldn't, our isolation worked really very well, where we had a wing of rooms. And if you can do that, I'd recommend it, because it worked very well for us.
That's great, already. Thank you so much for sharing that. Joe, over to yourself.
Yeah, for quite a number of our cases, we had to keep them on site and in the boarding houses throughout their whole isolation. And I think one of the key things there, talking about working within the parameters that are set by government restrictions, you can work with your local organisations to say, well, this is our interpretation of what we can do given our context. Can I create a private garden for the children to have some time out while we clean the communal areas near where they are and their dorms in some cases? So we did that to enable them to have some fresh air, and whilst they couldn't go and roam the school site, they could at least get out of their room briefly. I think one other thing is that, particularly in the early days, but that's remained throughout, we had a lot of nervousness from staff when attending to pupils who are isolating, who have tested positive, particularly if they had some symptoms. A large number weren't particularly unwell, and they've been okay. They've gone through that isolation without being very unwell. If some of them start to develop a cough, that's more worrying for staff. Initially, we'd have them in full PPE going to deliver food, or just to do a welfare check. We were asking for regular welfare checks, and as we've sort of moved through the journey, we've found that a face mask and sensible steps has been sufficient to safeguard our staff from getting COVID, and that's worked quite well. We've had very few instances where staff have contracted COVID from the boarders they're attending to, so that shows that just small steps can be successful in keeping them safe. I think that's really important for your colleagues to understand or learn from our experience there.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you, Joe. And Craig, yourself.
Yeah, just picking up on a couple of things and agreeing quite strongly, as I'm not surprised. It's really important to have that allocated space. Even though we've got lots of boarding houses, our complexity that we had was that they were all full. But being able to try and free up some space, and we did exactly what Joe was on about. The mental health of the students was paramount for us. So we worked with our local PHE agents in the area and had a part of campus where, once we've got 30 boys in the Year 9 house that were asymptomatic but all positive, they needed to go out, and they were all in the house together. It was one household, and our agencies were happy that we had a private garden space where they could actually be outside. So we were looking after their mental health, because it does affect the students a lot in that regard. And I think we need to be really careful of that moving forward. And also, what we were lucky with, we had more staff as we progressed through it that were willing to look after the students. Maybe those that had been either vaccinated or those that had already had COVID themselves. And we saw no transmission from the students to the staff who were looking after them in isolation of COVID at all, with the appropriate PPE and some of these staff. And that was a really good help for us, of the willingness of the staff and the boarding community in order to make life as normal as they could for these students who are having to be in isolation and in these uncertain times in and around their houses. But it's crucial to not just lock them away, get them out, play football, but that required, as we've all said, sort of communications with our local agencies, Public Health England, as to, are we okay within these definitions that you've given, and they're away from the school community. It's no good having them out on the Astro pitch in the middle of campus when the rest of school are around. And also what we noticed, it's external perception, depending where your schools are, and that it's the public's perception. If they knew that we had students isolated, then suddenly they were all out on a field. So we had to carefully manage that in terms of where the students were and where we allocated them on the campus and in the houses, so they could be safe from that external factor as well, really.
Craig, you mentioned there if you had the appropriate PPE, that there was the transmission between your staff and your students didn't really seem to be there. We've had a number of questions about what is the appropriate PPE, how strict does it need to be? Can you just touch on what you found the appropriate PPE was?
Yeah, well, we were guided quite firmly at the start by Public Health England, and for staff who were dealing with positive cases, they'd wear a face mask, they'd also wear a visor, they'd have aprons on, and then if they were handling stuff, they'd also sort of have gloves on. So that was sort of the ultimate PPE at the time, and that's what we started with. Ultimately, as time has evolved, I'm a scientist by trade myself. There's always so many different stories that you get in the press about the effectiveness of some of this. And we basically reverted to aprons and masks for the staff. But it was always an open choice. We provided everything for all staff, and we would go over and above to ensure staff were comfortable, and staff had all of those options with them. And then we worked with them appropriately. In our last isolation house, in the last period, the matrons or the house staff there, they would wear a mask and an apron if they were cleaning up and doing that. And that was it. And then hand washing and hand sanitizer at every corner within the house, basically.
Yeah, no, most definitely. Already, you've got your hand up there.
Just to echo, making things available to staff doesn't necessarily mean that they will always use them. And I think sometimes you need to allow them to use their professional judgment, because in the early days, we did absolutely everything we were told, and we didn't have a testing center on site. So a lot of larger schools have opened their own testing centers. They've bought themselves a PCR testing machine. We're too small to do that. So we have a local test site that we have to drive the children to. And we drive them in a van, and obviously the windows are open, but we were required to wear full PPE when doing that in the beginning. And the drivers found that they were more likely to have an accident driving in full PPE than actually catch COVID with the windows open and their masks on. And the very first times we would have had aprons and gloves and masks and visors, and then the driver's glasses, and then they would be trying to drive these children to their PCR tests. And actually, sometimes you just need to allow your staff to use their professional judgment, because partway through the drive, he just stopped the car, took them off, took his visor and left his mask on, took the visor off, and drove the car that way. Because you can't be in a position where your staff are so uncomfortable that they can't do their job, or where the children themselves end up in jeopardy because you're trying to tick boxes. The one set of tick boxes, though, because I'm really, really sorry, but I've looked at the time, and in about 10 minutes, I'm going to have to go because I have early parents. But what I would say, just in case I don't have a chance to do it, is the BSA had a COVID charter. I don't know that you have one in Australia just yet. If you don't, I'm sure Beth would be delighted to share it with you. We signed up to that, and for our international and local parents, if you are looking to give them some reassurance, it made a really big difference for us. And in the early days, it also just provided us with a guideline of actually what to do to help us feel confident. And it helped our staff feel better, because we would have probably done everything on that list anyway. But sometimes just having that kind of rubber stamp and to be able to say, look, the BSA say that we're doing the right thing is something really very helpful. So in case I don't have an opportunity to say that before I have to dash off, I thought I'd drop that in now.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. Already, you mentioned the testing site you at your school. You obviously have to go off campus for that. A question we're always receiving is how often do the boarders need to have their COVID tests? It might be one that I'll ask everyone, this one.
So we do lateral flow tests twice a week in the boarding house, and that we can do here on site. But every half term that they come back, they have a PCR test before they return to school. And that's something that we can request, but it's not something that we can make. We request that our parents do that before they come back, but we can't force them to do that because it's not part of government guidelines. But what we have found is that it has helped us pick up 3 asymptomatic cases so far that the LFTs did, the lateral flow test didn't. So the lateral flow tests were coming back negative, but the PCRs were positive. And that was something that was recommended to us by our local health team. It wasn't recommended to us by government guidance. And the fact that we stopped those 3 cases coming into school was a really positive thing because we'd had kind of a half-term break. We had no cases, and if we'd allowed them in or we hadn't caught them there, then we could have potentially had another outbreak. So what we ask most of our students to do is to have a PCR test if they can before they come back. I'd say 90% of them do. On the day that they come back, they all have a lateral flow test in-house before they're allowed to mingle around the house. And the parents have been really great in understanding of that. The going for a PCR test, there's different ways that you can have a PCR test here. You can drive to a test site, or you can order tests to be delivered to school, and then those are posted away. The downside to that is that it takes a really long time for those to come back in comparison to the ones where you drive. In some situations where pupils have come across exceptionally poorly in themselves, I actually haven't felt confident allowing my member of staff to be exposed to that in a car or in the van. And so in that case, we've taken the decision to send away the PCR test in the post, knowing that it will take a bit longer. But from a welfare factor, I just didn't think I could expose my member of staff to that because the symptoms were quite significant. And they were going to have to isolate anyway. The house is fine, it's nice, there's things for them to do, there's outside space and all of that. So the welfare of the child, who was pretty much, going to be in bed anyway, mental health wise wouldn't have suffered, but I think exposing my member of staff would have, so we didn't do that. But otherwise we're driving to the test site pretty frequently. We frequent visitors, and they know us well now, to the point that actually if we arrive in a Luckily bus and we don't have an appointment for 5 children and we've only got an appointment for 3, they'll see all 5 of us anyway. And routinely what happens when we get there is, even if we haven't booked PCR tests for our staff, they will automatically ask for our staff to be tested anyway when we arrive, and the staff seem to be quite happy with that.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. Yourself, Joe?
Yeah, very similar experience in terms of going to a local testing centre. We did explore other options, and as has been explained, that they take too long. So we made the decision to bus them out to the local testing centre at Gatwick. We were doing up to sort of 4 or 5 runs a day, separating individuals as those who were symptomatic or tested positive on a lateral flow test, and then separating the close contacts, because we were still testing those as well. That was a logistical challenge in itself, and I think that's what's come out of COVID, is that there's so many additional logistical challenges to try and navigate, and that does place a strain on staff, and it places a strain on you in terms of your planning as well. So it's just making sure you use that committee to make joint decisions, you collaborate with other schools to think about the best option, and you continue to reassess that and make sure you're looking after your staff. So yeah, otherwise it's a very similar experience.
Right, thanks, Joe. And yourself, Craig?
Yeah, very similar. We would test all of our students twice a week in their boarding houses. What we also do with ours, because we travel a reasonable distance for sports fixtures and that as well, so what we also do now that we're back allowed and we're allowed to play sports. And that again, if they're going away for a competitive fixture, every student has to test on the morning of their fixture in order to protect the other schools and clubs and societies that we might be playing against. So we would do that. We are similar in the sense that we would also bus students out to a testing centre. And if we could get air miles for the amount of travel that we have forwards and backwards, we'd all be doing pretty well out of it, I'm sure. But we also, because of our size and the international market, we have our own PCR Samba machine that we have invested in as a school, which is great. It means we can turn results around within an hour and a half on a PCR machine, but the numbers do mean that we're still running a bus to testing sites every day or every other day as well as we're going through, because it's an hour and a half per sample. It's an extra workload on the medical staff or myself or a couple of other staff that are suitably trained on it, but it is that extra burden and extra workload with regards to that as well, because as soon as you get one case in a house, if you've got close contacts, you're then looking at 10 cases, and 10 cases, you're going to be running the machine 24/7. So it's great to have it, but it puts an extra workload and burden on in that sense as well.
Yeah, definitely. And Dale, you've got your hand up there.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in with some general points, I think, pulling together what all three of our schools have been saying. You know, I think you need to be flexible. Craig highlighted there about testing on the day of sending them out for fixtures. I think you've got to be flexible as to what's in front of you, and there'll be times where you might want to test more and times where you'll go back to your regular testing procedure. I mean, one school I was working with a couple of weeks ago, because they had an outbreak that they just couldn't get on top of and they couldn't work out where it was coming from, they were testing all of their boarders more or less every day, just for a brief period of time, and that was in conjunction with advice they were given by local health experts, just to make sure they were on top of that outbreak and they knew what was going on. And then you know, in addition to that, I think you also need to think about your day pupil contingent. And we've had a couple of schools where they feel that the outbreak they've had has been brought in part by day pupils who haven't been testing rigorously at home. And that's been bringing in, and boarders have been getting it. So boarders have ended up asymptomatically, no symptoms, but they've been tested, they've been picked up. So they've ended up isolating. And actually the people who are bringing the infection to and from school aren't perhaps testing as rigorously and aren't being picked up. So I think a real, you know, you've got less control obviously over your day pupils, but a real expectation with your day pupil contingent, they absolutely have to follow the testing regime for everyone's benefit, I think is really important. And again, you know, I have a family member who in the early days was one of the ones who was helping the young people to conduct the tests. And you know, his experience was, don't just assume, even if they've been testing at home, don't just assume they'll know how to do it. You know, they will not necessarily be following the testing procedure with whichever device you're using in the way that the manufacturer states. They'll have perhaps been cutting corners, doing it more quickly, you know, not leaving it in the solution for the allotted time. You really do need someone, particularly with the younger ones in the early days, you do need someone to actually talk them through how it works, to watch them, you know, as they're doing the first few, until you're confident that they're able to test themselves without any issue. So I think, you know, that's another lesson we learned.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Dale. Already, you popped your hand up there.
One of the things that we were asked to do here when we came back this September was put in place contingency plans based on a set of government guidelines. And they've actually been really helpful for me in terms of managing more the day pupils and the boarders, because in some way what you do with your boarding house depends very much on each individual boarding house. But managing that in terms of when you get to a certain number of cases, what contingency measures do you put in place in order to curtail a further outbreak or an outbreak has been really, really helpful. So the guidance here tends to be 5 cases or 10% or whatever it happens to be in particular year groups. And schools have the latitude to adjust that based on their size. And we did that, and we put those contingency measures in place. And this year we've rolled them out quite a number of times for particular year groups, and having the flexibility, going back to that word that's come out quite a lot, to do that for particular year groups only has been really very helpful. So I ran out contingency just for my 6th form which meant that, for example, some of the measures were just the sixth form wearing masks, or the sixth form only went into lunch last so that the lunch hall could be cleaned down before they left, or in lessons, just the sixth form had to wear masks. The rest of school carried on as normal. And then I was able to roll that out to different year groups as appropriate, depending on their size. And actually that did help us. And our local authority at one point in one of our year groups that were in contingency requested or suggested that actually all of my pupils went for a PCR test before they came back to school. And they asked us to send them all home if they were day pupils until they all had a PCR and came back with a PCR. Now I was a bit cautious about doing that. Our families were very worried about time out of school. So what we did was we actually made that announcement on a Thursday and then said to our families, if you would like to take your child out of school early on Friday, because I mean, it depends when you can book a test. So some people, I made the announcement on Thursday afternoon. Some people could find a test on Thursday. Some people could only find a test on Friday, some only on Saturday, depends where they lived. If you would like to take your child early on Friday for a test, you can. So we gave them some flexibility. About 30% did. But because we ran them over a weekend, it meant by the Monday, 95% of tests were all back. So there were very few people who actually missed school anyway. And again, that did pick up. It did pick up asymptomatic cases that weren't coming up through lateral flows anyway. So having the flexibility and working with your surrounding agencies is really important, but making sure that appropriate contingencies are in place ahead of time. If you have one particular year group with an outbreak, but you want the rest of your school to pretty much carry on as normal, we found particularly helpful.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. Craig, you also raised your hand.
Yeah, and it follows perfectly. It's about extra testing that we did and mitigations in houses. And we can't say it enough of, and we've said it a number of times, of being flexible and also prepared. So if we reach that magic sort of, we put 3 cases in a house, we would have our students in that house, they'd be wearing masks again. If it increased, we'd be then looking at one-way systems within the boarding house, again, in order to minimize any potential contacts. And also, if we reach 10% in a boarding house, we would have put them on daily testing for 7 days on lateral flow tests, which were then supervised, be that by the house staff or matrons or whatever, because as Dale quite rightly pointed out, students may not always be doing their lateral flows as thoroughly as we would like them to do. But it's having that preparedness to react very quickly to the changing landscape that comes in front of you within the house, and being ready, right, well, we're going to do daily tests, we're going to wear masks, sorry, we're going to have to go to a one-way system, we're going to have to go to lunch and supper at different times, so you can build all those things in to control it within that house, really.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Craig. We'll keep moving on, guys. And Aretti's just got a hand up there.
Sorry, just as something a little bit, well, it's not funny, but it is really. Just be careful that you don't have children who also fake the outcome of their lateral flow test so that they don't have to come to school, because that has been a little bit of a thing here. There was something going around TikTok about how to do it, and it became like a little craze. So, you know, just be aware. Some of them might want a couple of days out. So you got to find the things that make you smile in these situations, don't you?
If it's not challenging enough, we've got TikTok there hurting us even more, don't we? We'll keep moving on, guys, because I'm keen to talk about vaccinations. We've had, again, numerous amount of questions around our students, our boarders required to be double vaxxed before they can re-enter the boarding house. Is there any rules on everyone's schools at the moment? Aretti, I might start with yourself.
Yeah, so we have young people here. The majority of my school are only eligible for one vaccination. The sixth form, by and large, are eligible for 2, but most of them haven't necessarily had the appropriate time frame passed. Probably about 60% of them have. The rest of my school, other than our year 7s who are underage, were all vaccinated here on site. And I suspect Joe and Craig had something similar either happening or happened already. And the success rate of that was really very positive. So we had 90% plus of our parents give consent for the jab, which was excellent. If you do have that type of situation, the best thing I'd say there is the communication with home about the importance of our perspective of vaccination, but we were not permitted to make it mandatory. So we haven't made it mandatory, and there are some pupils who haven't had a vaccination, but the vast majority of them have. Some of our parents who were very anti having a vaccine to start with and declined permission, shortly after everyone, their cases started climbing, came back to say, could we have one now? And from our perspective, it was too late because we're not responsible for it. So it wasn't necessarily a bad message to get out there to say, oh gosh, this has actually worked. And now our local authorities coming back actually next week for some kind of mop-up sessions. But since then, because our school was very lucky, we were one of the early ones to be vaccinated. Since then, the government have also opened up more vaccinating walk-in centres for under 16s, which has helped that kind of 10% that weren't vaccinated. But no, we haven't been permitted to say that it's mandatory. We've advised, but we haven't been able to make it compulsory.
Okay. No, that's great. Thanks for that already. Given the time, we'll keep moving on. I'm keen to talk about staff. Craig, could you just share a little bit with how you're managing your staff?
Yeah, it's really important with the staff to for them to feel supported as best they can, and I have staff that will be in daily just for conversations about concerns that they have within the boarding context. We had a number of staff early on that were very apprehensive about going into the boarding house and actually going into a house where there were cases or the potential to get cases. We drew up a list as a school of all of our vulnerable staff and critically extremely vulnerable staff, and redeployed them out from sort of boarding house roles. We were fortunate that we had numbers that would allow us to do that, and that's not the case for everybody. I understand that, but we were fortunate that we could, and some of those actually came back and says, no, actually I'm here for the students still, and they wanted to be in the boarding house, and then we gave them appropriate PPE or support in order to facilitate them carrying on their jobs. In sort of practical aspects of it, we supplied screens if matrons wanted screens when students were in the houses, but I would say now all of those have gone. I don't think any of our matrons or anything have screens. They found it too impersonal, and it was causing too many other issues on a mental health sort of front for the staff and for the students. So it's more the reassurance and how we can protect them more than anything that I found was key.
Thanks, Craig. Already, your hand's up.
Yes, I'm going to make my comment and head off because I can hear the parents outside my door.
No problem.
So just to echo everything that Craig said, and one of the things that we have done is we've perhaps taken a more cautious approach with our staff than the government guidance. So at the moment, you don't have to isolate if there's a positive case in your household. So you don't actually have to isolate. If you double jabbed, for example, you can just have your own PCR test, but you don't have to isolate. We taking a more individualized approach, and we do have a large staff, so we are able to do that. So where perhaps someone's spouse or child has tested positive at home, whilst according to the guidelines, they are able to come to work, we are encouraging them to stay home and have a PCR test on day 3 and then come to school. We aren't forcing them to do that. They are being paid, obviously, during that time, and we are asking if they do choose to follow that guidance that they teach their class remotely, and that's worked very well. From a staff welfare perspective, I think the staff feel cared for, but I recognize depending on the size of your staff, you may or may not be able to facilitate that. But from a staff welfare perspective, it's worked very well indeed. I do have to go. I'm so sorry I can't stay, but it's been lovely to talk with all of you, and always very happy to help. If there are any small schools out there that would like some extra guidance, really happy to take that. So have a good day, everyone.
Thank you so much
Thanks,
already. You've been fantastic. We really appreciate your time. Thank you. Joe, we'll move on to yourself. I noticed you have popped your hand up there.
I think echoing exactly what Craig and Areti have said, I think we have slightly less flexibility. So there was less scope for us being cautious and moving people out of certain roles. It's more a case of working with them so that they felt safe in specific circumstances. In the earlier phases where we have houses going into lockdown, a whole boarding house going into lockdown because there's one case, those were the guidelines at the time, it'd be a case of me sometimes going into the house with the individual and saying, look, where can we make adaptations? How can I adapt your role within the house so that you can still support the team, you can still support the pupils, but in a way where you feel more comfortable. So taking a quite active, bespoke approach to individuals was really important, and largely that helped them and helped them to perform their roles. I think stepping back and looking at the overarching thing, communication, as Dale said earlier on, it was key to ensuring that staff felt confident. You're getting a lot of media speculation about things that staff were being bombarded with, and that made people very nervous. I think so having calm communication which states the facts and reiterates the facts that we're dealing with rather than any speculation that might be out there, making sure that decisions you make are as transparent as possible. This is the decision we've made. This is why we've made the decision. We will continue to review this decision, and the protocols we have was really important in getting staff on board. And when you're looking at individual boarding houses and some of the changes you might have to make, given a new situation arising, involving the head of house, involving the staff in that decision as much as is possible, so that they feel empowered to take control. And in certain circumstances, you'd have two houses with very similar situations, but we might have a slightly different approach because the head of house wanted to manage their house in that particular way. As long as it was within the parameters that we felt were safe and sensible, we worked with them to do that. And that meant that we kept the teams on board and we kept their morale as high as possible in really challenging times. And we had circumstances where staff were working way longer hours than they should have been, because of staff illness and other challenges. So having those things in place helped them to manage that and still just about with a smile on their face.
Thanks, Joe. Craig, your hand's up. You're just on mute there, Craig. Sorry, Craig, you're just on mute.
Age-old thing. Right. We're all going to do it once in this session, aren't we?
We
must
are.
do. What we made sure, and we were fortunate because we bought a PCR machine, we engaged very heavily with our HR department as well to support staff. So we would offer testing for staff and families to ease that up, or even if that was providing transport and helping them to get to testing stations, just as part of our sort of HR program. We also got HR, and we have signed up for a LifeWorks program that our HR department sort of works with in order to give them support outside of sort of school if any of them needed that, which is something that we did. But what's really important with all the staff, and Joe touched on it at the start, and that is having your team of, be it your COVID response team or whatever it was referred to or called in schools, so they can respond, and they meet weekly. At the height of it, we were meeting bi-weekly or even daily as a COVID team, where we would review procedures, we would review where we were, we would have changes, and we could justify them and communicate it in a clear way to all staff, and getting the staff involvement, particularly if it's in boarding houses with regards to that, so they could see what we were doing and why. That was crucial in order for the staff to really understand what we were doing. As part of that sort of response team that we had, that we would have academic representation on it, we would have the estates team, we would have the operational side on there, we would have the catering side. So everybody knew what the full picture was at that moment in time, and then we could work out the best ways forward in order to progress that and keep all of the stakeholders informed. What we were very keen on is we didn't want staff to not feel part of it or to not get the message that we wanted them to have. So clear, relaxed comms, which is difficult at times, but we need to keep it as calm and as relaxed as we can. So when it does go out to the wider population, obviously everybody's getting the same consistent message.
It's a really good point you make, Craig. And the next question that I do have is, what was the reaction from your parents to the whole scenario?
On the whole, our parents, and I would say, were fantastic. They were really good. It's a global pandemic. We've never been in this position before. Admittedly, we're all sort of, it's something new, and something new still gets thrown up every day, pretty much. And we're trying to work out the best way through. And it's getting the message over to the parents as well that we are doing our best and we are working within the parameters we've got. And we've had complications now where Public Health England and our NHS are changing vaccination status and who can get vaccinated and when, and just reacting to things as they come, but in a timely manner. What you can't afford to do is for something to change and then you're 2 weeks behind on the curve by getting comms out to parents and actually reacting to what needs to. You've got to take the time to reflect on it, yes, but then it needs to be sort of acted and fed back in a timely manner. But on the whole, parents have been fantastically supportive in that regard.
That's great. Thank you for that. Dale, you've got your hand up, and I do apologise. I've only just seen the chat box now. You also wanted to mention something on vaccination. So please, if you wouldn't mind sharing your input now, but then also your comment on vaccinations would be fantastic.
Yeah, in fact, it ties in with what Craig's just been saying. I think, one of the big issues, and I know, compared to the UK, perhaps your international border population are not going to be as big as it is over here, but it's still really significant to you. I think the key message that we have learned, and this I think is where APSA comes in and talking, to other schools and working together, just in terms of the rules around not just getting the borders back to you, but then when the time comes, getting them home again. And we've had to do some real, communication with different governments. We've been in communication with UK government, with Hong Kong government, with different administrations around the world. I'm currently, waiting for a reply from Singapore, just around what the rules are. And it's partly that thing that Craig was saying just now, proving their vaccination status. We have a situation here where 12 to 15-year-olds can be vaccinated, but they can't actually prove they've had one because they're not allowed. They don't have the COVID pass. So we're working very hard on that. But also schools being flexible. It goes back to what we were saying, young people going back to Hong Kong because they've got a zero case approach in Hong Kong will need to isolate for 3 weeks when they get home. So schools are allowing them to go earlier. Some schools are allowing them to go a little bit earlier at Christmas so they can do their isolation. They can still have time at home. And again, we've had to work with government so that vaccine acceptance between the two countries has been agreed, so those young people can actually go. So there's a lot of work, I think, for individual schools to do about understanding, and it ties in, I think, with what Craig was saying about parents. Making sure you understand the parents' perspective, what the parents want. You communicate with them about what's possible, what's available, but also work with APSA, work with governments, work with local governments, work with national government, and get a whole clear picture about what's necessary and what's allowed. Not only to get the young people back to you, but to get them home again. And we know that some of them have been with you for a couple of years, and you would want to get them home when the time comes.
No, very well said, Dale. And gents that are left with us, I appreciate that the time is nearly running out. So what we might do, just to finish off the webinar today, if I could ask the three of you, 3 key learnings that you'd pass on to our boarding staff here in Australia or internationally, wherever it might be, that might assist them moving forward. Joe, I'm going to throw you under the bus because you briefly mentioned it at the beginning, so hopefully you've got a bit of an answer ready.
I think the 3 things I mentioned at the beginning, it's difficult because there are lots of things that are important, but getting that committee or response group, whatever you call it, with specific roles, one of those individuals should be a liaison between your school and the local agencies. So there's that clear, consistent relationship built with those people to get the information you need to, and others having specific roles within that, but a joint decision-making group. The protocol that you're going to use in your school needs to be absolutely crystal clear, and it needs to be communicated to staff in a way that they can understand. It's going to change, and they have to realize it's going to change. So that the clearer it is, getting it to the simplest form is really important, and then it's more likely to work effectively. And making sure that you are just continually considering staff and pupil welfare and the simple things you can do to support staff and pupil welfare. And a big part of that is for you entering your holiday period. For your leaders within schools, they're going to have to continue to plan. So making sure that you set up really clear timelines of when you're going to meet, you know, who's going to focus on what, so that you still have space to recover, to recuperate. Because in our first summer, I think we probably had 2 frequent meetings as a leadership team, and it really eroded that time that we had to recover in a really challenging time. And you need to be refreshed, ready to go for that new term, new year. So make sure you get that right, make sure you get the planning timeline right for you in that point.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Joe. Craig, we'll hand over to you.
Hi, thanks. My list was more than 3, unfortunately, but fortunately Joe touched on a few of them, so I'll let him take those. I think being flexible and being able to respond with the team, like I say, with your COVID response team, being flexible and being able to respond quickly to the changing landscape, because it can change over the course of 12 hours very quickly. I remember having a conversation with our students about, of course, all of your exams are going to go on. We had an assembly on the Thursday morning, and then we got to Thursday afternoon and the government had cancelled all the exams. So you've got to have that evolving picture and be able to do that. Be very clear with your comms to parents and staff, clear communication strategy, and being able to respond appropriately. Mental health and support and the welfare of the students and colleagues and staff in the school is crucial with regards everything that you do. And I would say make sure you're looking out for them, but also make sure you're looking out for your team leaders, and that can be your middle leaders or your senior leaders, as well as the sort of the other colleagues within the school, because people will end up, when things go wrong, they'll be putting in 20-hour days, 20-hour days sometimes for a long stretch, and you need to be looking out for those colleagues and staff, because you've got to have your own breathing time still, so you can work effectively when something changes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Craig. That's great. And Dale, we'll finish with yourself.
Yeah, I think, back up everything that Craig and Joe have said, and I think in particular, picking up on Craig's point, I remember back to last January when a lot of international students had just flown in. We had a whole new cohort of Aussie gappers ready to do their year in UK schools, and they arrived on the Monday, and on Monday evening we went back into lockdown. So you've got to be prepared for anything. But I think my 3, in addition to all those things, and the key ones being staff welfare, pupil welfare, my 3 on top of that would be clear what the guidance requires you to do, but also be clear on where the guidance gives you flexibility to make your own local decisions. And I think that's been absolutely key, where schools have been able to interpret the guidance in a way that works for them, and have kept within the guidance, but in a way that works for them. Absolutely flag issues, amongst yourselves, and with APSA, if you've got any concerns, flag them early. We are, and as an association, we're able to help, we're able to engage with government, we're able to engage with key partners, but if we don't know what the issues are, we're not able to do that. So flag those issues early. And I think my final one, I hope Joe and Craig would agree with this, is just, be confident that you can actually do this. I think in the very early days, there was a real fear about how was this going to work? Are we going to be able to do this? But I think if you go in with a really confident attitude, as school leaders, then actually you can do this. It's going to be challenging. It's going to be difficult. There'll be a few bumps and in the road along the way, but be absolutely confident you can do it. Then I think you'll have some really good outcomes.
That's great, Dale. Thank you so much. And gents, I appreciate we could talk on this for hours, but you the 3 of you probably have a big day of work ahead of you. So we will wrap things up there. And on behalf of ABSA, I'd just like to thank you all so much already as well. We couldn't have had a better panel with us, your morning, our evening. So thank you all for your guidance, your expertise. I've no doubt in the world that this will help our member schools. We just wanted to thank you for giving the time of day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting us. Cheers.
Also, a huge shout out must go to Beth from the BSA, who assisted, who put all of this together. Beth, you were fantastic to deal with. As I said, you chose the best panel possible for us, that's for sure, and we really do appreciate it. So thank you. To all of our member schools, we hope you enjoyed this webinar. Of course, if you have any questions from the webinar, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We look forward to being in contact. Thanks for now. Bye.